what if the Islam that's practiced today isn't actually from the Quran? A new book makes that exact argument. The author, Professor Bayraklı, kicks things off with this really challenging statement. He says that over time, a lot of cultural practices have been mistaken for actual religion. And this has led to what he calls an Islam without the Quran. Pretty powerful stuff. So what common beliefs does he challenge? Let's look at a couple of key examples. First, he takes a look at the popular signs of the apocalypse. He points out some pretty striking similarities between these signs and pre-Islamic texts. So he argues these ideas actually came from outside traditions, not from the Quran itself. The Quran, he points out, says something very different, that the end will come totally unexpectedly. So, predicting signs directly contradicts the Quran's message. Now, let's look at another topic, intercession. The belief that prophets or saints can step in and talk to God for you. But once again, the author puts this belief right up against a verse from the Quran. His takeaway? The Quran is pretty clear. All power of intercession belongs entirely to God. Okay, so if these popular beliefs are challenged, what's the author's solution? He has one. His answer is simple, a strict, rigorous return to the Quran as the only source. He actually breaks it down into a 3-step process for believers to follow. And this quote really captures his whole argument for a faith centered only on the Quran. The whole point, he believes, is to get back to the original message of the faith. So it leaves you with this huge question. What happens when faith is questioned by its own primary source?
All right, let's just jump right in with a title that really makes you stop and think, An Islam Without the Quran. Now, this comes from a book by Professor Bayraklı, and wow, what a question, right? It immediately gets you wondering, could the faith that so many people practice today actually be disconnected from its most important book? And listen, the author, he does not pull any punches. Right from the get-go, in his introduction, he drops this bombshell. He's not just talking about a few little things that need tweaking. No, his argument is that the way Islam is practiced today has, fundamentally drifted away from its source. I mean, that's a huge statement. It basically sets the stage for a major challenge to how things are. So what's the key thing to understand here? Well, the author makes it really clear he isn't going after anyone's personal faith. Not at all. What he's really pointing to is this mix-up, a confusion between cultural traditions that get passed down and what the actual scripture says. The idea is that for generations, people have just accepted these traditions as part of the religion without ever really stopping to ask that one simple but massive question. Wait a second, does the Quran actually back this up?
The river of faith, the author's core analogy. Okay, so how did this all happen? How did things drift so far, in his view? Well, the author uses this really powerful analogy to explain it all, and it's all about a river. This idea is absolutely central to understanding his whole argument.
But hang on, before we dive into that river analogy, there's one key word you absolutely have to know. It's hurafler. The author uses this term all the time. So what does it mean? Basically, it's his word for all the superstitions, the heresies, the cultural baggage, all the stuff that he says has seeped into the religion over the centuries. But, and this is the important part, you can't actually find it in the Quran.
And this is where that river analogy really clicks. Imagine the Quran as the source of the river, the spring where the water is absolutely pure and crystal clear. But as that river flows down through centuries of history, other little streams and tributaries start to flow into it. And they're carrying all sorts of things, foreign ideas, local superstitions, human opinions. So his whole point is that many people today aren't drinking from that pure source anymore. They're way downstream at the delta, where the water is, it's murky. It's all mixed up.
Case study 1, signs of the apocalypse.
All right, so that's the big idea, the theory. But what does this murky water actually look like in real life? The author gives some really specific examples of these so-called hurafler. And the first one he gets into is a huge topic, the signs of the apocalypse.
And this is where it gets really interesting. You see this clear split. On one side, you've got these really common beliefs, right? The idea that specific signs will show up before the end of the world. Things like false prophets appearing, huge wars, people in a race to build taller and taller buildings. But then the author points you directly to verses in the Quran that, in his reading, say the complete opposite, that the end will be sudden, no warning, and that its timing is a secret that only God knows. The two views just don't line up.
So you have to ask, where did all these ideas about specific signs even come from? Well, according to the author, this is a textbook case of hurafler.
He actually traces them back to traditions from outside of Islam, even pointing to sources like the Gospels. The argument is that these ideas kind of seeped into the culture over hundreds of years and somewhere along the way got mistakenly attached to Islamic teachings.
Case study 2, the question of intercession, or shafa'at. Now, this next example, this one is a really big deal. It's something that's deeply personal for a lot of believers. We're talking about the idea of intercession on the Day of Judgment. So, there's this very widespread belief, right? The idea that on the Day of Judgment, great figures, like prophets or saints, will be able to step in and, well, speak up for us, to plead our case to God and ask for mercy on our behalf. It's a really comforting idea for sure, but it's an idea the author takes on directly.
So how does he challenge it? Well, his entire argument really boils down to verses like this one. He presents it as the final word on the subject. Say, all intercession belongs to Allah. For him, the message here is crystal clear. The authority to intercede, to grant that mercy, belongs to God and God alone. It's not something that can be delegated to anyone else.
Now, it's not quite as simple as just saying no intercession, period. The author's view is actually more detailed than that. When you look at his breakdown, he argues the Quran says that humans, like prophets or saints, don't get that authority. But angels, they can intercede. But, and this is the absolute key, only if God gives them specific permission. It's not their own power. It's a power that's loaned to them in that moment.
And it gets even more specific than that. Who even qualifies for this very limited, very specific kind of intercession? According to the author, the Quran lays out some pretty clear conditions. This isn't some kind of get-out-of-jail-free card. He argues it's reserved only for people who've already shown their commitment through their actions. You know, people who perform their prayers, who feed the poor, who truly believe in the Day of Judgment, and who don't turn their backs on the Quran itself. A call to scrutiny, the author's final message. So after looking at these examples, what's the big takeaway? Where does all of this lead? Well, it all comes together in the author's final message, which is really a call to action for every single believer.
And really, this is the heart of the entire book. What the author is pushing for is a kind of personal investigation, you know? He's saying, don't just accept a tradition because that's how it's always been done. His challenge is for believers to take every single thing they've inherited, every belief, every cultural practice, and hold it up right next to the Quran. For him, the Quran is the final test. It's the ultimate yardstick, and if something doesn't measure up, you have to ask why. So he lays out a pretty simple but really powerful method to do this. Think of it as a 3-step process for, as he puts it, purifying your faith. Step 1, take a common belief or a tradition you follow. Step 2, go directly to the Quran and really check it out. See what the text itself says. And step 3, and this is the hard part, be brave enough to question and maybe even let go of anything that just doesn't seem to fit. And that really brings us full circle. This whole analysis leaves us with the exact same challenge the author puts to his readers. It's a question that asks you to look inward and really think, how much of what I believe, how much of what I do comes directly from the scripture, and how much of it is just tradition? How much is just water from much, much further down that river?
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're wading into what might just be one of the most, well, challenging theological critiques out there in the Muslim world right now.
It's a big one.
It is. The central idea is, on one hand, totally radical, but on the other, it's profoundly simple. It's this assertion that a religion, over centuries can get so bogged down by tradition, by culture, by superstition.
All these external interpretations.
That it basically detaches itself from its one pure source, its sacred text.
Yeah.
We're talking about the idea of a Quran-less faith.
And that's exactly the territory we're exploring today. Our source is the comprehensive and I'd say pretty uncompromising work of Prophet Dr. Bayraklı, specifically his book Kur'ansız Müslümanlık, which translates to Quranless Islam.
And he's not just, nitpicking minor rituals here.
Oh, not at all. He's going right for the foundations. He's challenging beliefs held by millions, arguing that they're just deep-rooted errors in what he calls Hierophiller superstitions, false beliefs, that have, and this is his phrase, sucked the blood of pure Islamic monotheism for generations.
That is powerful language.
Yeah.
And it really sets up our mission for this deep dive. We need to systematically look at what Bayraklı says are these errors, but just as importantly, we have to understand his method.
Yes.
Because he's positioning the Quran as the one and only authority, the sole, sufficient, definitive source, and basically dismissing anything that you can't trace directly back to that text.
Right. And his whole methodology is captured in this really powerful analogy he uses about the flow of knowledge. He uses the Kızılırmak River in Turkey as a metaphor.
Okay.
He argues that past scholars, and he critically calls them sözdenin alimleri, so-called religious scholars, made this huge intellectual mistake. Instead of getting their knowledge from the river's source,
The pure spring.
which is the Quran, they went all the way to the end, where the river empties into the sea at the Bafra Plain.
So by that point, the water's traveled hundreds of miles. It's not pure anymore.
Exactly. By the time that spiritual river gets to the plain, it's mixed with, in his words, many different waters and foreign substances.
And what are these foreign substances?
He lists them. They are Zoroastrian ideas, Greek philosophy, Christian concepts, Jewish folklore, what's known as Israeliyat.
We'll get into that later, I'm sure.
Oh, we will. And even ancient Babylonian superstitions. All of this stuff got absorbed into the cultural flow, and then somehow it was accepted, it was legitimized, and it was taught as if it were pure Orthodox religion. And it ended up displacing the actual teachings of the Quran.
Okay, so the immediate question anyone listening would have is, does this mean the Quran itself has been corrupted?
He's very, very clear on this point, and it's foundational. He cites a verse from the Quran, Hijr 9, which affirms that God protects the Quran and guarantees its preservation. The text itself, he says, is pristine. It's uncorrupted.
So the corruption is in the culture around it.
It's entirely in the framework of interpretation. The human culture surrounding the text has been compromised by all this historical buildup. It's a critical distinction for him. The text is perfect. The human reading of it is what's been flawed.
All right, let's start unpacking this cultural compromise then. If his whole argument is about restoring the purity of Tawhid absolute monotheism, it makes sense that he starts with the very declaration of faith.
He does, and it's controversial right out of the gate. Bayraklı takes on a very specific, modern, reformist argument, which he completely rejects, by the way.
Okay.
And that's the argument that questions including Muhammadur Rasulullah, Muhammad is the messenger of God, in the testimony of faith, the Shahada.
And the logic there is that putting the prophet's name right next to God's name, it might compromise that absolute monotheism, maybe even border on shirk or polytheism.
That's the critique, exactly, that it elevates a human being too close to the divine. So some argue you should only testify that there is no God but God.
But Bayraklı pushes back on that.
He pushes back hard. He says that idea is itself a deep error. And he uses the Quran to defend the traditional formulation. He cites the verse Fath 29, which explicitly puts the prophet's name right next to Allah's. The verse says, Muhammad, the messenger of Allah.
So his argument is, if God put them together in the revelation, who are we to separate them?
Precisely. If that proximity was a problem, if it was shirk, God would not have ordained it in the very text that defines the faith. It's a kind of textual proof.
It's an elegant defense, using the book to counter a perceived threat that's supposedly derived from the book itself.
It is. And he takes it a step further. He says, mentioning the prophet's name is actually a safeguard, not a danger.
Yeah.
By making sure the believer says Muhammad is a servant and messenger, kul ve peygamber, you actively prevent his deification.
So it draws a clear line.
It draws a very clear line. It's a reminder not to repeat the mistake made by, say, Jews and Christians, who, as the Quran mentions in Tawbah 30:31, elevated figures like Ezra and Jesus to a kind of quasi-divine status. The inclusion in the Shahada honors the role, but strictly maintains his human status.
Okay, so once he secures that foundational creed, the critique logically moves to practices that introduce human intermediaries. This is where that cultural contamination really becomes toxic to Tawhid. Let's start with Rabita.
Rabita. So the word itself just means link or connection. But in practice, especially in some Sufi orders like the Naqshbandi, it's become this highly ritualized, almost esoteric practice.
Right.
The source defines it as this ritual where an aspirant, a murid, focuses their heart and mind on their spiritual guide, a Kamil Murshid, who's believed to have reached these really high spiritual stations.
And the goal is to sort of absorb their spiritual energy, their light, to help your own journey.
Yes, it's often done by visualizing the guide's presence, maybe even focusing on their image during meditation. It's seen as a kind of spiritual shortcut.
And that's where Bayraklı sees the danger.
That's the fundamental danger for him. This reliance on a human guide as a necessary spiritual conduit, he says, puts Tawhid in jeopardy because it inserts an intermediary between the worshiper and God.
Okay, but the practitioners must have a justification for this.
They do. The critical issue is they cite the Quranic command Rabatu from the verse Al-Imran 200. But Bayraklı's whole point is that they've taken a linguistic root and just grafted a completely unauthorized esoteric meaning onto it.
So if the verse actually says Rabatu, how does he prove that the meaning is so different from how it's being used?
It's all about context and semantics. Bayraklı insists the true Quranic meaning of Rabatu is not link your heart to a human guide. It's much simpler. Be vigilant, be watchful, or be awake.
So he's taking this internal esoteric concept and turning it into a universal command for alertness.
Exactly. A command for active self-control and defense, not passive dependence. And he breaks it down into 3 necessary forms of vigilance. None of them, by the way, involve linking to another human.
What's the first one?
The first is psychological vigilance. This is the internal battle. It means constantly guarding your inner self, your heart, your mind against destructive instincts. Ego, greed, envy, and so on.
So it's a defense against Satan's influence.
That's exactly it. He cites Isra 64, which describes Satan attacking with words, infantry, and cavalry. So this requires constant mental preparedness, not, outsourcing your spiritual health to a guide.
That immediately makes faith a very active individual responsibility.
Yeah.
What about the social dimension?
That's the second type, social vigilance. This means being alert to societal ills, to moral corruption, to intellectual and cultural attacks coming from outside. The very yabancı kültürler from his river analogy.
The foreign substances.
Right. It's about safeguarding your belief system from being eroded by things like, in a modern sense, consumerism or philosophical movements that might contradict Quranic morality.
That really connects back to the book's title, Quranless Islam, guarding against those cultural imports.
It's the central theme. And the third form is military or strategic vigilance. This connects directly to the context of the verse Al-Imran 200, which is talking about early Muslim battles like Uhud. It means being awake at your guard post, learning from history.
Like the archers at the Battle of Uhud.
Exactly. Who failed to stay vigilant, abandoned their posts, and it led to a military disaster. So for him, Rabita is transformed from this controversial esoteric practice into a lifelong commitment to rational, psychological, social, and physical self-discipline.
So the misuse, in his view, is a cultural tradition hijacking a clear command for personal responsibility.
Yes. And that dependence on a spiritual figure leads right into his critique of vassal, the intermediary.
Which is a very common practice.
Incredibly common. Vassal is widely understood as using a holy person, a saint, a deceased prophet, a living guide to intercede with God for you. Bayraklı calls this an egregious contamination of Tawhid with shirk.
Okay, let's drill down on that. Why is seeking an intermediary so damaging to this concept of pure monotheism?
Because it treats God like a king or a bureaucrat that you can't access directly. You need a middleman. He uses this great Turkish term, torpil.
What does that mean?
Torpil means favoritism, or using your connections to get something. Seeking a saint to intercede for you is like seeking torpil a favor based on who you know, not on your own merit. And Bayraklı says God simply does not allow that. It undermines the personal effort that Tawhid demands.
So if that common understanding is wrong, how does the Quran actually define vassal? He must have a counter reading.
He does, from Maida 35. The verse commands believers to seek the vassal to him. Bayraklı argues vassal here simply means path, or the means to approach God. And the means are your good deeds, your sincerity, your prayer, not another person.
In other words, the vassal is what you do, not who you ask.
But that's it, perfectly put. The key insight is that you have to earn the path yourself. If you rely on someone else's spiritual bank account, you're admitting a failure in your own dedication. It cuts out the direct line to God that monotheism is all about.
The theological implication there is huge. It forces the believer to stand alone before God, responsible for their own actions.
Completely. And if he rejects human intermediaries while we're alive, it's only logical he'd reject them after we're dead. This brings us to his views on the afterlife, starting with the transfer of reward, or savab.
This is a massive practice. Reading the Quran for the deceased, giving charity in their name.
It's everywhere. And Bayraklı's critique is twofold, and it connects right back to Tawhid and accountability.
So let's take the first point, the intention of worship.
Right. Reading the Quran or giving charity are acts of ibadah, of worship. And worship, by definition, must be for God's pleasure alone. He argues that if you perform an act of worship with the primary intention of benefiting a dead person, you're directing that worship towards someone other than God.
Which blurs the lines.
It blurs the lines and, in his view, edges towards shirk. If the primary beneficiary isn't God, the act itself is theologically compromised.
And the second point goes back to that idea of personal accountability.
It clashes with it completely. He cites Pakara 134 and 141, which are crystal clear that every soul earns its own reward. The ledger is closed at death. If you could just have your relatives do good deeds for you after you're gone, the urgency of doing them in your own life, well, it kind of evaporates.
And he has a very specific Quranic verse to back up this idea of the ledger being closed.
He does. He points to Munafiqun 10. It's a powerful verse. It describes a dying person pleading, "My Lord, if only you would delay me for a short time so I would give charity and be among the righteous."
Right.
Bayraklı asks the obvious question. If his surviving children could just give that charity for him, why would he be making this desperate last-minute plea? That plea is all the proof you need that the window for personal action closes at the moment of death.
So charity from the living benefits the living. But what about the idea of a righteous child's prayers helping their parents? That's a very common belief.
He clarifies that. The child's role, according to the Quran, isn't to transfer their earned merit, their sawab, to the parents. Their role is to pray for the parents' forgiveness and mercy.
So it's a request, not a transaction.
Exactly. Prayer, dua, is a supplication to God. Transferring merit is like trying to edit God's accounting books. They are two completely different things.
This brings us to what is probably the most explosive topic in this section, qabr azaba, or grave punishment. The author claims this is a total fabrication, a hurraf, imported from other cultures.
This is a major, major claim. And he roots it in the influence of what's called Israeliyat. We should probably define that term.
Yes, please.
Israeliyat basically refers to narratives and traditions that came from Jewish and Christian sources and entered early Islamic scholarship, often through converts. They were kind of integrated into commentaries on the Quran and Hadith.
So they weren't necessarily malicious, but they were outside information that got treated as revelation.
That's a great way to put it. They were the foreign substances, in his river analogy. And Bayraklı says the belief in qabr azaba, this idea of being punished in the grave by angels right after burial before the final day of judgment, has its roots in ancient Mesopotamian, Babylonian, Egyptian, Jewish, and Christian beliefs about the afterlife.
So what's his textual evidence from the Quran for rejecting it?
It's very simple. He states definitively, the term qabr azaba never appears in the Quran. Not once.
Wow.
And then he goes through all the verses that are traditionally used to prove it. For example, verses that talk about a near punishment. He argues these are referring to punishment in this world-like historical defeats, social shame, or they're referring to the punishment of the akhirah, the hereafter. But never, he insists, punishment specifically in the grave before the final judgment.
He also has a very logical, almost rationalist argument using the story of Pharaoh.
The Pharaoh problem, it's a brilliant little logical puzzle he presents.
Yeah.
The Quran says in Yunus 92 that God saved Pharaoh's body as a sign for future generations.
Right, his body was preserved.
So Bayraklı asks, if grave punishment is real, how does Pharaoh experience it? He was never buried. His body was on the shore. Then he looks at Mu'min 46, which mentions Pharaoh's people being exposed to the fire morning and evening.
Which is often interpreted as happening in the grave.
But he says that can't be right. How can an unburied corpse be physically punished? It's a contradiction. He argues that verse must be referring to a spiritual judgment or something that happens in the hereafter, but it can't be literal physical punishment in a non-existent grave. The Quran can't contradict itself.
This also calls into question all those famous hadith stories about the angels Munkar and Nakir questioning the dead.
He applies his Quranic filter to those as well. The detailed hadith descriptions of angels questioning the dead, punishing them with huge iron rods, he says this contradicts what the Quran says about judgment.
Where does the Quran say it happens?
The Quran says questioning happens at the gates of hell on the day of judgment, as in Zumar 71 and Mulk 8-9, not immediately after burial in a tiny grave.
And there's also the issue of the prophet's knowledge of the unseen, the gaib.
Exactly. Some hadith imply the prophet could hear or know about specific people being punished in their graves. Bayraklı says this contradicts Araf 188, where the Quran is clear that the prophet does not know the unseen. Knowing the detailed post-mortem status of every individual is the ultimate unseen knowledge, reserved for God alone.
He even makes a very practical, almost funny critique about the iron rods.
He does. He asks, if angels are swinging these massive iron rods, how do they even fit inside a small, tight grave? And taking it historically, what did they use before iron was even discovered? It's a rationalist critique designed to make you question if these are literal descriptions or metaphors for the horrors of the hereafter that have been misapplied to the grave state.
So he sees it as a transplantation of ideas.
Yes. The descriptions of hellfire and punishment are real, but they belong to the akhira, the final judgment. They've just been copied and pasted into the period of the grave.
And finally, on this topic of eschatology, he applies the same critique to the Sirat Bridge.
The Sirat Bridge, yeah. The one famously described as thinner than a hair, sharper than a sword, that you have to cross to get to paradise. He puts this squarely in the category of an imported hereth.
Why? What's the source this time?
He finds almost identical parallels in ancient Zoroastrianism with their concept of the Chinvad Bridge.
Wow, okay. That's more than just a coincidence.
It seems to be. He cites Zoroastrian texts like the Avesta, which describe this Chinvad bridge that widens for the righteous, but for the wicked, it becomes, you guessed it, thinner than a hair, sharper than a sword. It determines if they go to paradise, hell, or a middle ground.
So he's seeing a pre-Islamic Iranian religious concept, almost perfectly preserved in Islamic tradition.
Absolutely. And his main point is the term Sirat Köprüsü does not exist in the Quran. So its appearance in Islamic tradition with this near-identical description is for him the perfect example of how these intellectual worms, as he might put it, can burrow into a belief system and distract people from the actual Quranic teachings.
This is a great transition to the nature of prophecy itself. How does the author see the role of prophets, especially when it comes to things outside normal human experience? Let's start with the return of Jesus.
This is a belief that is, deeply ingrained in the Hadith literature. The idea that Jesus, Zai, will return near the end of time, fight the Antichrist, the Dajjal, and rule with justice.
A very common belief.
Very. But Bayraklı just categorically rejects it. He sees it as another import from Israelite.
So what's his Quranic argument against it? Because the counter-argument is that Jesus never died. He was just raised up to heaven.
He focuses entirely on the language, on the specific words used in the Quran about Jesus' fate. He looks at Al Imran 55, where God tells Jesus, I shall cause you to die, vefat atarashim, and elevate you to my presence. For Bayraklı, the word vefat means a definitive physical death, an isal, a natural end, not just a spiritual raising.
But so many scholars interpret vefat there differently, as taking up or seizing the soul to prevent his death on the cross, which would allow for his return. How does Bayraklı argue against that huge body of classical interpretation?
He uses Jesus' own words from the Quran as his proof. He points to Maida 117, where Jesus is speaking to God and says, but when you caused me to die, vefat atirans, you were the watcher over them. He's using the past tense of the verb.
So if Jesus himself says it happened.
Bayraklı's point is, it must have happened. It was a physical, literal death. And he adds more evidence from Maryam 33, where Jesus talks about 3 key moments in his life. The day he was born, the day he dies, and the day he's resurrected. There's no fourth event, no mention of a return. The sequence is birth, death, resurrection, end of story.
That is a very strong textual argument. What about the controversial verse in Zuruf 61?
Yes. Zuruf 61 says, indeed, it is knowledge concerning the hour. The whole debate is about that little pronoun, who, which can mean it or he. Does it refer to Jesus, making him a sign of the hour, or does it refer to the Quran, which is the knowledge that tells us about the hour?
And Bayraklı favors the Quran interpretation.
He does, firmly. He argues that interpreting it as Jesus interrupts the flow of the surrounding verses, which are all about following Prophet Muhammad. The Quran as the sign makes more contextual sense to him.
And finally, there's the theological check. The finality of Muhammad's prophethood.
This is the bottom line for him, citing Azab 40. Muhammad is the seal of the prophets. If Jesus were to physically return and implement God's religion, even if it's Islam, that would imply a role of leadership that would, by necessity, challenge or diminish the finality of Muhammad's mission. For Bayraklı, it creates a theological contradiction he can't accept.
Okay, let's shift to miracles, mu'jiz. The author seems to really push the idea that the Quran itself is the only miracle that matters. This seems to downplay the other spectacular miracles often attributed to the prophet.
That's the tension he's addressing. He champions the Quran as the one enduring universal miracle, and he directly confronts the expectation for flashy, temporary miracles like Moses had with his staff or Jesus with healing the sick.
Right.
He uses Isra 59 to explain why God specifically refused to grant Muhammad the physical miracles the Meccans demanded, like turning Mount Safa into gold or raising the dead.
But why did God refuse? If miracles worked before, why not this time?
The reason, according to the source, is actually quite harsh. In the past, when nations were given these huge, spectacular miracles like the she-camel of Thamud and they rejected them, God sent mass destruction, collective punishment.
So the miracles were primarily about warning and deterrence.
Exactly. They were sent for Qur'an, for warning and fear. But Muhammad's prophethood was defined by rahmat, by mercy. If God had sent a fear-inducing miracle that was then rejected, it would have required the destruction of the whole Meccan community.
Which would contradict the merciful nature of his mission.
Absolutely. So the Quran, as an intellectual, spiritual miracle that can benefit all generations, is seen as far superior. Its rejection doesn't trigger immediate collective annihilation. So expecting temporary physical sideshows, in his view, undermines the permanent intellectual force of the Quran.
And he applies this same critical eye to the story of the Miraj, the ascension to heaven.
The methodology is perfectly consistent. If it's a non-negotiable fact of faith, it must be stated explicitly in the Quran. Bayraklı points out that the word Miraj is not in the Quran.
But the night journey, the Isra, is.
Yes. The Isra, the night journey from Mecca to Jerusalem, is confirmed in Isra 1. But the subsequent physical ascension to the heavenly is not. He argues if that were an essential belief, God would have detailed it, just like he detailed the first part of the journey.
And he also critiques the very physical descriptions of the Miraj in the Hadith, especially the story of a kind of preparatory surgery.
He does. He focuses on the account of the prophet's chest being physically opened and washed with Zemzem water before the journey. Bayraklı says this focus on a literal, physical operation completely distracts from the true spiritual meaning.
Which is?
The spiritual opening of the chest, the illumination of the heart with divine light, is a spiritual reality that is available to all believers. It's mentioned in verses like Zumar 22 and in Shira 1. To reduce that profound spiritual event to a one-time physical surgical procedure, he argues, is to miss the entire point.
So again, separating the universal spiritual truth from a singular literal narrative.
Exactly. The focus should be on the spiritual illumination, not on the physical details of an operation.
Okay, this brings us to what I think is the most crucial section for that aha moment about accountability. The concept of divine will, or Mishiet. This is so often used to justify fatalism.
This is where he delivers, I think, his most powerful theological correction. Because if you accept the fatalistic view that God predetermines everything, including sin and disbelief, then human choice is meaningless and God becomes, unjust for punishing people.
It's a huge problem.
Yeah.
And he focuses on how certain verses about guidance or hidayat are translated.
Yes. The common translation is often, Allah guides whom he wills, Allah dilediğin hidayete erdirir. Which sounds arbitrary. If guidance is just random, then accountability is impossible.
So how does he correct this?
He argues that this translation fundamentally misreads the Arabic grammar and the context. He insists the proper interpretation is Allah guides whoever wills. The guidance is a response, not an arbitrary selection. It depends on the human choice, the human dilemma, to seek the path.
So the sequence is flipped. It's not God picking someone at random. It's God responding to the person who is trying.
That's it. He cites Rod 27, which is very clear. It says, God guides the one who turns to him Yunalini. The action starts with the human. Bayraklı points out, if God wanted to, he could force everyone to believe, and M35 says that. But God chooses to leave humans free, which is the necessary condition for this life to be a test, an imtihan.
That shift in agency is huge. It completely restores the dignity of human effort and the justice of God's judgment.
It's the absolute cornerstone of his entire project. And he uses this to dismantle the excuse that polytheists in the Quran use to justify their sin.
Right. In M148, where they say, if Allah had willed, we wouldn't have associated others with him. It's the ultimate passing of the buck.
It is. And God's response in the Quran is a flat-out rejection. God says they're just following Zan conjecture or false opinion. So Bayraklı concludes that all sin, all disbelief, comes directly from the individual's own will, their own dilemma.
But God is still the creator of all things. How does he square that?
He makes a very fine theological distinction. He says the desire for evil comes from the person, and God only creates the result, the physical act. But the desire for good is shared by both the person and God creates that result.
So God creates the mechanism, but the human provides the intention and direction.
That's a perfect way to put it. If God were to constantly interfere and force people away from error, it would actually be an injustice to those who genuinely chose the good path on their own, and it would destroy the whole point of free will.
So believing that God forces people to go astray is, for him, a deep misunderstanding.
He calls it one of the most profound wounds to the true understanding of divine justice.
So we have covered a massive amount of ground here, from the definition of faith itself all the way to the mechanics of salvation. If you had to synthesize Bayraklı's entire project, what would it be?
He's forcing the listener, the reader, to confront the uncomfortable possibility that many beliefs they hold as foundational are actually just layers of cultural buildup, Purifeller, that pull our attention away from the Quran as the one and only sufficient source.
So his goal is really educational.
It's restorative and educational. He wants to encourage deep critical thinking, Sorgulama, and to use the Quran's own authority, its autorite, to break the chains of unexamined tradition. And he knows it's hard. He acknowledges that these non-Quranic ideas have been defended by religious leaders for centuries. They have a powerful veneer of holiness.
The implication is that just relying on tradition without checking it against the source is a kind of intellectual slavery.
It is. And he says the tragic pattern is that when these cultural ideas clash with a clear Quranic verse, people often choose the side of the Khuraf, the tradition, and then they try to twist the Quran to support it. His whole work is an attempt to stop that manipulation and put the Quran back on the throne as the sole judge.
Okay, let's bring this all home with a final thought for you to chew on. Our whole discussion on Mashiach showed that human choice, human dalim, is central to accountability. Building on that, the source material also talks about shafa, or intercession. And it suggests that the uncertainty about who actually receives intercession is deliberate. It's meant to be a constant driving force for us to do good deeds, instead of just sitting back and waiting for a guarantee.
That ambiguity is absolutely purposeful. If intercession were guaranteed to everyone who just says they're a believer, it would create mass moral laziness. Why bother? But the Quran, as Bayraklı points out, is very strict about intercession. It belongs entirely to God. It's only granted to those he permits.
So the fact that it's possible but not guaranteed for you creates this necessary theological tension.
That's it exactly. Bayraklı argues the purpose of keeping shafa restricted and uncertain is to keep humans motivated. If you have certainty, if you know you have torpor, that favoritism waiting for you, you become complacent. Why strive? By keeping it ambiguous, the faith creates this perfect, motivating rhythm.
Which is?
The rational fear of judgment on one hand, and the profound hope of God's mercy on the other. And those two things together are what should fuel continuous, active, ethical action.
So the final insight is that by clearing away all these cultural layers that promise a passive salvation, you are forced back to a difficult, but maybe more liberating truth. That the very ambiguity surrounding your ultimate fate could be the necessary catalyst that compels you to strive, to choose the good, and to earn that path to God yourself.
A difficult path, for sure, but one that restores justice and dignity to individual effort.
A really profound and necessary deep dive. Thank you for guiding us through such a rigorous critique.
My pleasure. It's essential stuff for anyone thinking about the sources of their beliefs.
And thank you, the learner, for joining us on the deep dive. We'll see you next time.
Welcome back. Today we're diving into the opening chapters of Kur'ansız Müslümanlık.
Right, a really potent book that argues many common religious practices are more about cultural buildup than the Quran itself.
It's incredibly sharp, very challenging, but we've identified a few crucial opportunities to really refine its structure and maximize its persuasive power.
Yeah, the core goal here is to dismantle tradition where it clashes with the text.
Exactly. Which brings us to our first point, which is really about pacing. The sheer density of high-stakes theological issues packed right into the first chapter may lead to reader fatigue and resistance.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you can see the intent. Chapter 1 just launches this blitz.
It's a total blitz. We're talking 16 distinct, deeply controversial concepts, one after another. Tawhid, Shafat, grave punishment, Demirak.
It's just too much too soon. Before the reader can even get their bearings and appreciate the book's core method, which is Quranic supremacy, they're already on the defensive.
You've hit the nail on the head. It's the cognitive load. I mean, when you treat a core belief like Tawhid And a speculative idea like grave punishment is, just two adjacent items on a checklist.
You dilute the power of both arguments. The reader is still mentally fighting you on concept A while you're already trying to convince them about concept B.
It feels less like a scholarly demolition and more like a flood of grievances.
Right.
So the reader needs to be grounded in the why before they're hit with a dozen challenging whats.
So the suggestion here is pretty clear. We need to group the most sensitive critiques structurally. Give that core concept, the idea of Quranic authority, some room to breathe and build credibility.
Okay, but let me challenge that for a second. If you group them, don't you lose some of that initial shock value? Part of the point seems to be showing the reader the sheer volume of non-Quranic beliefs they might hold.
That's a fair point, but I don't think you lose the volume. You're just managing the reveal.
Okay.
Think of it like a sustained siege instead of a scattered attack. You're not hiding the issues, you're just organizing them for maximum impact.
So instead of 16 separate skirmishes, it's 3 or 4 major battles.
Exactly. Look at all the concepts around, say, the relationship with the dead. You have Rabita, Vasile, Shafayat, grave punishment. They're all connected.
They're all part of one larger cultural assumption about the role of the deceased.
Right, so you group them. You hit that single cultural pillar with 5 powerful related arguments. That's a much stronger blow than 5 scattered critiques spread across 30 pages.
That makes a lot of sense. A focused thematic takedown? What would another group look like?
Well, you could separate the purely theological issues like Tawheed or the concept of divine will, the Mashiach, into one section on core beliefs.
And then the more speculative cosmological stuff like the signs of the hour or the Mirak in another.
Precisely. The rhythm becomes theme, demolish, rebuild. It lets the reader process one massive shift in their thinking before you ask them to confront the next.
That kind of pacing is just essential for a topic this heavy.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so that really solidifies the structural solution. Now let's talk about the evidence itself, because there's some exceptional material in here that is frankly being undersold.
This is probably the biggest opportunity in the whole manuscript.
It is. Our second point is this. The author needs to elevate the historical and comparative research and make it a core methodological tool.
You're talking about the Chinvad Bridge.
I am. The author identifies the Zoroastrian Chinvad Bridge narrative as the likely source for the Islamic cultural belief in the Surat Bridge. This is an editorial goldmine. But the weakness is that this incredible discovery, which proves the book's entire thesis about cultural imports, is just tucked away in a subsection. It's treated like a minor detail.
And it's not a detail. It's the methodological backbone of the whole project. If your argument is that these beliefs are foreign imports, this is your smoking gun.
It's the aha moment.
It is. It proves the process historically. So it shouldn't be a hidden argument. It should be the foundation for the entire critique.
So the suggestion is obvious then. Bring this discovery right to the front. Make it a central pillar of the method, right there in the introduction.
You have to, because it changes the author's persona in the reader's mind.
How so?
You're no longer just a theological antagonist saying, you're wrong because the Quran doesn't say that.
Right.
You become this historical detective saying, you're wrong because I've actually tracked the source of this belief to a pre-Islamic Iranian religion. And here is the verifiable proof. That is so much more powerful.
But is there a risk there? If you lead with a deep historical dive, do you alienate the reader who came for a faith-based critique?
I think the risk is minimal, and the reward is just enormous. We're not talking about a full academic dissertation in the intro, just a powerful demonstration of method.
You're winning their trust up front.
You have to. If a reader accepts that this one huge, commonly held belief, the Surat Bridge, is a historical import, they're going to be far more open to your other critiques.
So how do you do it concretely?
I'd suggest a dedicated subsection in the preface or intro. Call it something like Our Method, Tracing Imported Concepts.
And use the bridge as the prime example?
Yes, and you have to leverage the imagery. That famous description of the bridge, finer than a hair, sharper than a sword.
Which every Muslim has heard.
Everyone knows it. And if you can show the reader that that specific vivid phrase comes directly from the Zoroastrian Avesta and is demonstrably not in the Quran.
That's a devastating opening blow.
It lends massive upfront credibility to the whole mission. You're basically giving the reader the detective's magnifying glass before you start pointing out the crime scenes.
I love that framing. It turns the author's authority from just assertion into empirical demonstration. That's a huge strength multiplier.
It really is.
Okay, that covers structure and evidence. Let's move to the final piece, which is always the hardest. What do you build in the place of what you've torn down?
The reconstruction phase.
Exactly. Our third and final point is the need to strengthen the constructive alternative to maximize the impact of all this demolition.
And the book is brilliant at demolition. I mean, its takedown of concepts like grave punishment using the Quranic story of Pharaoh is it's masterful.
It is. The weakness, though, is that after these really effective demolitions, the constructive, Quran-only vision that's meant to replace the old superstitions is, well, it's often just implied or mentioned too briefly.
And that leaves the reader feeling unmoored. If you skillfully take away a familiar concept, even a false one, you create this vacuum.
You create anxiety. You have to fill that space with certainty from the text immediately.
So the suggestion is critical. After dismantling a major cultural assumption, dedicate a clear, titled section right after it to articulate the pure Quranic replacement.
Ground the reader again.
Empower them with the revealed text so they don't feel like they've just lost something, but that they've gained clarity.
Let's make that concrete. What does that proactive reconstruction look like?
Okay, so take Kabir Azab, the grave punishment. After you've shown why it's not a Quranic concept, you immediately include a small subsection. Title it something like, The Quranic Focus, Certainty of the Mahshad.
The Day of Judgment.
Exactly. You proactively synthesize the verses, like in Mudassid or Zumar, that establish where the real point of certainty and difficulty lies. You show that the Qur'an's focus is on accountability on Judgment Day, not speculation about the grave.
So you're not just taking something away, you're redirecting their spiritual focus to something more solid, more textually grounded.
You have to. It shifts the book from being purely critical to being restorative, which I think is the author's ultimate goal.
And this applies to the more theological concepts too, right? Like divine will.
Perfectly. The critique of Mashiach, the fatalistic idea that Allah leads astray whomever he wills, is strong. But don't just stop at correcting the misinterpretation.
You have to build the alternative.
Right. Follow it with a section that defines the powerful human agency the Quran demands. Use verses from Furqan or Muzammil that emphasize the individual's choice to find a path to God.
So you demolish the fatalistic error and immediately establish the truth of human responsibility.
It's like you're showing them the old, misleading map and then, right away, handing them the corrected one. Demolition followed by immediate, focused reconstruction. It's vital.
It is. So this material is exceptionally strong. The analysis, the grounding in the Quran, it's all there. We just focused on 3 key areas to maximize its impact.
First, managing that initial density. Reorganize that first chapter by grouping the topics thematically to avoid overwhelming the reader.
Second, take that incredible historical evidence, the Surat Bridge's Zoroastrian roots, and move it right to the front. Use it to establish your authority and method from page 1.
And finally, and maybe most importantly, for every false concept you tear down, you have to immediately and robustly build the pure Quranic alternative back up. Fill the void you create with certainty from the text.
These refinements will take a very strong manuscript and make it significantly more persuasive and accessible. We strongly encourage you to refine these sections and submit the next iteration for further critique.
Welcome to The Debate. So today we're diving into a really fundamental issue that comes up in our source material. And that's this profound tension between the Quran as a pristine, self-sufficient text and the huge body of religious practice that's been built up over centuries. The central question really is this. Is the theological framework that most people accept today, especially when we talk about the afterlife or prophetic stories or divine mediation, is that framework based on explicit Quranic revelation? Or is it actually leaning very heavily on, controversial interpretations and what the source text calls khurafela, these foreign cultural ideas that have been imported over time?
Right.
And I'll be arguing that the integrity of Tawheed, the absolute oneness of God, is significantly undermined by relying on concepts that just aren't in the Quran or that even contradict it. Things like grave punishment or the prophet's physical ascent. My position is that the purity of the revelation has been compromised.
And I'm going to argue that while the Quran's authority is, of course, immutable, you need a robust intellectual and theological tradition to really articulate a faith that people can live. The legitimacy of these concepts rests on necessary secondary sources, like the Hadith and Sunnah, and on, valid interpretations of verses that deal with things beyond our immediate grasp. I'd say these elaborations clarify and deepen the faith. They don't betray it.
Okay, I do see the appeal of grounding daily practice in a long-standing tradition, but let me offer a different perspective that's rooted really firmly in the text itself. My core thesis is that many foundational beliefs in modern spiritual life, things like seeking intercession through individuals, which is wasile, or the mystical connection to a guide, rabita, they don't actually draw their authority from the Quran. They come from these external traditions, what the source material calls Israeliyat, that have sort of polluted the faith over time. I mean, just consider vesila or rabita. When these are done with the intention of using an intermediary, a spiritual guide, a murshid, to get to God, they inherently challenge the concept of tawhid. The Quran is so clear that all authority over intercession or shafa belongs only to Allah. Zumar verses 43 and 44 stated emphatically, God alone grants it. And this practice, rabata, it's often wrongly tied to a Quranic command. The actual verse in Ali Imran 200, it uses the term rabata in the context of psychological resolve, of being steadfast, guarding the frontiers, not some esoteric heart-to-heart mystical connection. So the widespread adoption of these ideas, introducing these non-Quranic go-betweens, it just signals a major deviation from that direct relationship with God.
I understand the concern. I absolutely do. Maintaining the purity of Tawhid is paramount, and any act that constitutes real shirk or idolatry is of course unacceptable. But I come at this from a slightly different angle, which is the necessity of application. The Quran gives us the core principles, but you need intellectual and legal traditions to elaborate on those brief scriptural points to create a system that, billions of people can actually live by. We can't just dismiss these deeply established doctrines because a specific phrase like grave punishment, kabir azaba, doesn't appear word for word. These doctrines are efforts to explain theological necessities, things like barzakh, that intermediate state between death and the day of judgment.
Right.
And on intercession, well, the verses you cite focus on who possesses the authority, and that's Allah. But then you have Baqarah 255, which explicitly says that intercession is possible, but only with God's permission. So that verse confirms the concept exists, it's just divinely managed. It's not abolished entirely. The theological framework built around the Hadith is trying to explain how God permits and manages this process. If you strip all that away for a strict minimalist reading, you risk leaving this comprehensive faith system without the detail believers need when they face the unknown.
Let's dig into that a bit, specifically on one of the most critical parts of faith that I think has been compromised, the eschatological framework. I want to focus on the popular belief in grave punishment, or kabir azabe. I'm just not convinced by the argument for it because, as you say, the Quran never mentions it, and the attempts to sort of derive it from the text often fall apart when you look closely. So let's take the verse that's most often cited, Sajda 21. It talks about a near punishment, a yagan azab. And yes, this is before the greater punishment, but the context that follows is crucial. It says this punishment is given so that they may return or repent. Balki donerlar. Repentance is only possible in this world, before you die.
Sure.
So that near punishment has to refer to worldly calamities, hardships in this life that are meant to draw a sinner back to God. It can't be a physical torment in the grave after the chance for repentance is long gone. And that brings me to another point. The really detailed beliefs around the signs of Qiyamah, they're highly suspect. The source material shows pretty meticulously that many of these elaborate signs, that specific timeline of wars, false prophets, the physical return of Isa or Jesus, are foreign imports. They are almost a mirror image of narratives you find in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 24. That points to a clear Israelite origin. Why would we rely on that?
That's a fascinating textual analysis, but I'd argue it's an overly restrictive reading of the transition into the afterlife. And while I do acknowledge the concern about imported narratives, the concepts of accountability and transition, they just have to begin immediately at death. To counter your reading of Sejde 21, I'd say that reducing all near punishment to just worldly hardship, a financial loss, and illness, it kind of trivializes the gravity of death itself. The critique of the specific phrase kabir azaba is maybe semantic, but the idea of immediate post-mortem suffering is, I think, implied pretty explicitly in the text. I mean, look at the verses about Pharaoh's family in Mu'min 46. They are described as being exposed to the fire morning and evening. Now, this torment is happening now, in the intermediate state, in Barzakh, well before the final day of judgment. That requires an intermediate state where souls experience some form of reward or punishment. Whether we call it punishment of the grave or torment of the Barzakh, the theological reality of immediate accountability is there. And as for the signs of Qiyamah, the Hadith literature is there to elaborate on the Quran's general warnings about a sudden judgment day, like in RF's 187. We have to appreciate the psychological role these details play. They prepare believers. And yes, historical parallels exist across prophetic traditions, but the role of our tradition is to ground those universal concerns within the specific framework of the final revelation.
I appreciate the need for structure, but that structure cannot be built on practices that I think fundamentally violate the singularity of God's role. So let's go back to seeking intercession, the sile, and the spiritual connection, rabata. I would frame these not as educational or transitional, but as direct violations of divine justice. The insistence on seeking divine access through specific individuals, alive or dead, it directly pollutes the unity of God. And there's a secondary issue here, which is the idea of transferable reward. The source material points out that the common practice of giving charity, tzedakah, on behalf of someone who has died is, well, it's fundamentally flawed. The Quran states very plainly that the reward for good deeds is paid directly to the doer. Baqarah 272 is unequivocal. The good you do will be paid to you. The reward is not transferable. So, if even a simple charitable reward can't be transferred, then seeking a deceased person to intercede for you is structurally unsound. It's basically asking for divine favoritism, an unearned advantage, which goes against the clear, merit-based system in the Revelation.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that equivalence between seeking guidance and seeking favoritism. I mean, let me explain why. That argument collapses the crucial distinction between praying to someone, which is undeniably shirk, and praying through or for someone, which can be an act of piety as long as the intention, the niyat, is sound. When a Muslim prays for the forgiveness of their parents, as in the example from Ibrahim 41, they're not committing idolatry, they're fulfilling a duty. The source material even acknowledges this. Children can pray for their parents. The act's integrity rests on the internal intention. Spiritual mentorship, which is the true function of Rabita for serious practitioners, isn't about bypassing God. It's about seeking the perfected discipline and insight of a murshid to strengthen one's own connection to God. We seek mentors in every field to master our skills. To argue that spiritual mentorship suddenly becomes idolatry is, I think, an unnecessarily narrow interpretation. The action has to be judged on whether the practitioner elevates the guide to a divine status, which dedicated practitioners would vehemently deny.
But the issue is less about the practitioner's denial and more about the objective theological consequence of the practice itself. If the mechanism you're using is structurally identical to the pre-Islamic practices that the Quran came to abolish, then intention alone can't really purify it. But let's shift to the contested reality of the prophetic ascent, the Miraj. For me, the narrative of the prophet's physical journey through the seven heavens is one of the most potent and historically traceable khurafela that the text discusses. The whole concept of a physical ascent, orokia, was something that this believer specifically demanded as a sign, and Allah explicitly rejected this demand in the Quran. In Isra 93, the prophet is told to say he is only a human messenger. If a physical ascent were this central validating event,
Why wouldn't Allah mention it when addressing that very demand? And, the historical trace is undeniable. The source material shows that elements of the Miraj narrative, especially that bridge thinner than hair, sharper than a sword, are traceable to Zoroastrian texts like the Ardadav Verifone. That overlap proves its external, non-Quranic origin. All we can confirm from the text is the Isra, the earthly journey to Al-Aqsa. The celestial journey is an add-on.
But to dismiss the Miraj just because a single word is absent from the Quran or because of some historical parallels, that feels like a really radical approach that disregards the entire structure of our worship, our ibadah. The distinction between the Isra, the journey, and the Miraj, the ascent, is an established theological necessity, and for a critical reason. The Miraj narrative is the foundation of the 5 daily prayers. According to extensive hadith from figures like Enes ibn Malik, the 5 prayers were negotiated in the heavenly realm during this ascent. That is a critical pillar of our faith. Establishing the salat requires an extraordinary event. The spiritual opening of the chest in Inshira 1 is one part of it, yes, but the journey to meet previous prophets, as detailed in the tradition, is what establishes the final prophet's authority. The physical reality of the ascent is what's required to ground the negotiations for the prayers in objective reality. If we just dismiss the narrative because it shares motifs with earlier traditions, we're basically saying that any human attempt to articulate spiritual reality is just pollution, rather than an evolution and final perfection of a universal idea.
I have to challenge that idea, that a foundation of faith must rest on narratives that are provably external. The prayers were established, that's not in dispute, but we have to ask, was the entire elaborate superstructure of a physical ascent necessary for that? Or did that structure just attach itself to the prayers later on, giving them an authority that came from, non-scriptural, almost folkloric sources? The purity of the text ought to be sufficient. If the Quran is the complete and final revelation, which we both agree it is, then it should contain the necessary foundation for the core pillars of the faith, without needing these detailed extra-scriptural stories whose origins are, they're historically questionable.
And I would argue that the Quran's completeness isn't contradicted by the necessity of the Sunnah and Hadith to fully explain and execute its commands. I mean, the complexity of the afterlife and the gravity of the prophetic role demand an explanatory context. We're really just discussing the difference between the source text and the living tradition. And that tradition, through its elaborations on the intermediate state, or the prophetic journey, it fills the gaps left by the Quran's conciseness. It allows for a structured, communal, and intellectually rich practice of faith.
At the end of the day, this exchange just reinforces my initial position. The real challenge for believers is to meticulously distinguish between the clear, sufficient text of the Quran and all the subsequent cultural accretions, the hurafarla. These often come from unreliable external sources, the Israeliyats, and they introduce concepts that either contradict Tawheed or just confuse the straightforward ideas of divine justice and accountability. Theological precision, for me, demands a purification back to the scriptural root.
And while that impulse for purification is compelling, I would just caution against the kind of textual minimalism. A complex religious life needs layers of interpretation and tradition to articulate realities like the afterlife and spiritual mediation, even if God alone manages it. The concepts we've talked about, even if they share historical parallels, are accepted elaborations that provide necessary structure and continuity to the faith. It can't sustain itself on literal textual silence alone.
So we've explored this deep intellectual tension between adhering strictly to the self-sufficiency of the Quran and the theological impulse to bring in secondary sources and contested interpretations on eschatology, intercession, and prophetic events.
Indeed. And the fundamental question of whether these widely accepted beliefs truly illuminate or perhaps obscure the core message of the revelation, that remains central to understanding this foundational material.